Continuing Caesar in Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. Against fighting, and more because of some unlucky presages and a vision he had in a dream. Well, what's unlucky or lucky, that's sort of actually up to you with how you interpret the omen, and you can direct the meaning of occurrences towards representing whatever you want, basically, that you can think of. But those who were about him were so confident of success that Domitius and Spinther and Scipio, as if they had already conquered, quarreled which should succeed Caesar in the pontificate, and many sent to Rome to take houses to fit to accommodate consuls and praetors, as being sure of entering upon those offices as soon as the battle was over. The cavalry especially were obstinate for fighting, being splendidly armed and bravely mounted, and valuing themselves upon the fine horses they kept, and upon their own handsome persons, as also upon the advantage of their numbers, for they were 5,000 against 1,000 of Caesar's, nor were the numbers of the infantry less disproportionate, there being 45,000 of Pompey's against 22,000 of the enemy. Caesar, collecting his soldiers together, told them that Corfinius was coming up to them with 2 legions, and that 15 cohorts more under Calenus were posted at Megara and Athens. He then asked him whether they would stay till these joined them, or would hazard the battle by themselves. Now, F in Greek is probably more of a kind of like the Sanskrit fum, sort of F and V sort of thing at the same time. But it's a rather rare letter. But, we're using Greek names here. They all cried out to him not to wait, but on the contrary to do whatever he could to bring about an engagement as soon as possible. When he sacrificed to the entities for the illustration of his army upon the death of the first victim, the augur told him within 3 days he should come to a decisive action. Caesar asked him whether he saw anything in the entrails which promised a happy event. That, said the priest, you can best answer yourself, for the entities signify a great alteration from the present posture of affairs. If, therefore, you think yourself well off now, expect worse fortune. If unhappy, hope for better. The night before the battle, he walked the rounds about midnight. There was a light seen in the heavens, very bright and flaming, which seemed to pass over Caesar's camp and fall into Pompey's. And when Caesar's soldiers came to relieve the watch in the morning, they perceived a panic disorder among the enemies. However, he did not expect to fight that day, but set about raising his camp with the intention of marching towards Scatussa. But when the tents were now taken down, his scouts rode up to him and told him the enemy would give him battle. With this news he was extremely pleased, and having performed his devotions to what he considered to be gods and goddesses, set his army in battle array, dividing them into 3 bodies. Over the middlemost he placed Domitius Calvinus. Antony commanded the left wing, and he himself the right, being resolved to fight at the head of the 10th Legion. But when he saw the enemy's cavalry taking position against him, being struck with their fine appearance and their number, he gave private orders that 6 cohorts from the rear of the army should come and join him, whom he posted behind the right wing, and instructed them that they should do when the enemy's horse came to charge On the other side, Pompey commanded the right wing, Domitius the left, and Scipio, Pompey's father-in-law, the center. The whole weight of the cavalry was collected on the left wing, with the intent that they should outflank the right wing of the enemy, and rout that part where the general himself commanded. For they thought no phalanx of infantry could be solid enough to sustain such a shock, but that they must necessarily be broken and shattered all to pieces upon the onset of so immense a force of cavalry. When they were ready on both sides to give the signal for battle, Pompey commanded his foot, who were in the front, to stand their ground and, without breaking their order, receive quietly the enemy's first attack, till they came within a javelin's cast. Caesar, in this respect, also blames Pompey's generalship, as if he had not been aware how the first encounter, when made with an impetus and upon the run, gives weight and force to the strokes, and fires the men's spirits into a flame, which the general concurrence fans to full heat. He himself was just putting the troops into motion and advancing to the action, when he found one of his captains, a trusty and experienced soldier, encouraging his men to exert their utmost. Caesar called him by his name and said, "What hopes Caius Crassinius, and what grounds for encouragement?" Crassinius stretched out his hand and cried in a loud voice, "We shall conquer nobly, Caesar, and I this day will deserve your praises, either alive or dead." So he said, and was the first man to run in upon the enemy, followed by the 120 soldiers about him, and breaking through the first rank, still pressed on forward with much slaughter of the enemy, till at last he was struck back by the sound of a sword, by the wound of a sword, the wound of a sword, which went in at his mouth with such force that it came out at his neck behind. Whilst the foot was thus sharply engaged in the main battle on the flank, Pompey's horse rode up confidently and opened their ranks very wide, that they might surround the right wing of Caesar. But before they engaged, Caesar's cohorts rushed out and attacked them, and did not dart their javelins at a distance, nor strike at the thighs and legs, as they usually did in close battle, but aimed at their faces. For thus Caesar had instructed them, in hopes that young gentlemen, who had not known much of battles and wounds, but came wearing their long hair, in the flower of their age and height of their beauty, would be more apprehensive of such blows, and not care for hazarding both a danger at present and a blemish for the future. And so it proved, for they were so far from bearing the stroke of the javelins, that they could not stand the sight of them, but turned about and covered their faces to secure them. Once in disorder, presently they turned about to fly, and so most shamefully ruined all. For those who had beat them back at once outflanked the infantry, and falling on their rear, cut them to pieces. Pompey, who commanded the other wing of the army, when he saw his cavalry thus broken and flying, was no longer himself, nor did he now remember that he was Pompey the Great, but like one who some entity had deprived of his senses, retired to his tent without speaking a word, and there sat to expect the event, till the whole army was routed, and the camp appeared upon the works with which were thrown up before the camp, were they closely engaged with his men who were posted there to defend it. Now, the accusation that Muhammad faced, that they say, oh, well, maybe he was possessed by one of our gods. This is, the sort of thing they meant would have been the case, if that was the case. Then first he seemed to have recovered his senses, and uttering, it is said, only these words, "What? Into the camp too?" he laid aside his general's habit, and putting on such clothes as might best favor his flight, stole off. What fortune he met with afterwards, how he took shelter in Egypt, and was murdered there, we tell you in his life. Caesar, when he came to view Pompey's camp, and saw some of his opponents dead upon the ground, others dying, said with a groan, "This they would have. They brought me to this necessity. I, Caius, Caesar, after succeeding in so many wars, had I missed my army." These words, Pollio says, Caesar spoke in Latin at the time, and that he himself wrote them in Greek, adding that those who were killed at the taking of the camp were most of them servants, and that not above 6,000 soldiers fell. Caesar incorporated most at the foot, whom he took prisoners with his own legions, and gave a free pardon to many of the distinguished persons, and amongst the rest to Brutus, who afterwards killed him. He did not immediately appear after the battle was over, which put Caesar, it is said, in a great anxiety for him, nor was his pleasure less when he saw him present himself alive. There were many prodigies that foreshadowed this victory, but the most remarkable that we are told of was that at Tralles, the temple of Victory, stood Caesar's statue. The ground on which it stood was naturally hard and solid, and the stone with which it was paved still harder. Yet it is said that a palm tree shot itself up near the pedestal of this statue. In the city of Padua, one Caius Cornelius, who had the character of a good augur, the fellow citizen and acquaintance of Livy, the historian, happened to be making some augural observations that very day when the battle was fought. At first, as Livy tells us, he pointed out the time of the fight, and said to those who were by him that just then the battle was begun and the men engaged. When he looked a second time and observed the omens, he leapt up as if he had been inspired, and cried out, "Caesar, you are victorious," as much surprised the standers by. But he took the garland which he had on from his head, and swore that he would never wear it again till the event should give authority to his art. This Livy positively states for a truth. Caesar, as a memorial of this victory, gave the Thessalians their freedom, and then went in pursuit of Pompey, when he was come into Asia, to gratify the Pompous, the author of the collection of fables. He enfranchised the Canadians. I wonder if that's where we get Canada from, but I mean, probably not, but and remitted 1/3 of their tribute to all the people of the province of Asia. When he came to Alexandria, where Pompey was already murdered, he would not look upon Theodatus, who presented him with his head, but taking only his signet, shed tears. Those of Pompey's friends who had been arrested by the king of Egypt as they were wandering in those parts, he relieved and offered them his own friendship. In his letter to his friends at Rome, he told them that the greatest and most signal pleasure his victory had given him was to be able to continually save the lives of fellow citizens who had fought against him. As to the war in Egypt, some say it was at once dangerous and dishonorable, and no ways necessary, but occasioned only by his passion for Cleopatra. I forget exactly how it's said, but and so a Q sound instead of a K sound, and then a D instead of a T, and I think there's another couple sound or two in there. Others blame the ministers of the king, especially the eunuch, Pothinus, who was the chief favorite and had lately killed Pompey, who had banished Cleopatra and was now secretly plotting Chaucer's destruction, to prevent which Chaucer from that time began to sit up whole nights under pretense of drinking for the security of his person, while openly he was intolerable in his affronts to Chaucer. Now, okay, occasionally I will not attempt to say, well, what if it was Greek? I would say, what about the older language, right? Both by his words and actions. For when Chaucer's soldiers had musty and unwholesome corn, grain of whatever sort, measured out to them, Pothinus told them they must be content with it, and since they were fed at another's cost, he ordered that his table should be served with wooden and earthen dishes, and said Chaucer had carried off all the gold and silver plate under pretense and arrears of debt. For the present king's father owed Chaucer 1,750 myriads of money. Chaucer had formerly remitted to his children the rest, but thought fit to demand the 1,000 myriads at that time to maintain his army. Pothinus told him that he had better go now and attend to his other affairs of great consequence, and that he should receive his money at another time with thanks. Chaucer replied that he did not want Egyptians to be his counselors, and soon after privately sent for Cleopatra from her retirement. She took a small boat and one only of her confidants, Apollodorus, the Sicilian, along with her, and at the dusk of the evening landed near the palace. She was at a loss how to get in undiscovered, till she thought of putting herself into the coverlet of a bed and lying at length, whilst Apollodorus tied up the bedding and carried it on his back through the gates to Chaucer's apartment. Chaucer was first captivated by this proof of Cleopatra's bold wit, and was afterwards so overcome by the charm of her society that he made a reconciliation between her and her brother, on the condition that she should rule as his colleague in the kingdom. A festival was kept to celebrate this reconciliation, where Chaucer's brother, a busy, listening fellow, whose excessive timidity made him inquisitive into everything, discovered that there was a plot carrying on against Chaucer by Achillas, general of the king's forces, and Pothinus, the eunuch. Chaucer, upon the first intelligence of it, set a guard upon the hall where the feast was kept, and killed Pothinus. Achillas escaped to the army, which raised a troublesome and embarrassing war against Chaucer, which it was not easy for him to manage with his few soldiers against so powerful a city and so large an army. The first difficulty he met with was want of water, for the enemies had turned the canals. Another was, when the enemy endeavored to cut off his communication by sea, he was forced to divert that danger by setting fire to his own ships, which, after burning the docks, thence spread on and destroyed at the great library. A third was in an engagement near Pharos. He leaped from the mole into a small boat to assist his soldiers who were in danger, and when the Egyptians pressed him on every side, he threw himself into the sea, and with much difficulty swam off. This was the time, according to the story, he had a number of manuscripts in his hand, which, though he was continually darted at and forced to keep his head often under water, yet he did not let go, but held them up safe from wetting in one hand, whilst he swam with the other. His boat, in the meantime, was quickly sunk. Perhaps there was some plank or something that being left out of why how he survived. At last, the king, having gone off to Achilles and his party, Chasar engaged and conquered them. Many fell in that battle, and the king himself was never seen after. Upon this, he left Cleopatra queen of Egypt, who soon after had a son by him, whom the Alexandrians called Chasarion, and then departed for Syria. Thence he passed to Asia, where he heard that Domitius was beaten by Phormicus, son of Mithridates, and had fled out of Pontus with a handful of men, and that Phormicus pursued the victory so eagerly that though he was already master of Bithynia and Cappadocia, he had a further design of attempting the lesser Armenia, and was inviting all the kings and tetrarchs there to rise. Chasar immediately marched against him with 3 legions, fought him near Zela, drove him out of Pontus, and totally defeated his army, when he gave Amantius, a friend of his at Rome, as account of this action. To express the promptness and rapidity of it, he used 3 words: I came, saw, and conquered, which, in Latin, having all the same cadence, carry with them a very suitable air of brevity. Hence, he crossed into Italy, and came to Rome at the end of that year, for which he had been a second time chosen dictator, though that office had never before lasted a whole year, and was elected consul for the next. He was ill spoken of because, upon a mutiny of some soldiers who killed Cascanius and Galba, who had been praetors, he gave them only the slight reprimand of calling them citizens instead of fellow soldiers, and afterwards he assigned to each man 1,000 drachmas besides a share of lands in Italy. He was also reflected on for Dolabella's extravagance, Amantius's covetousness, Antony's debauchery, and Carfinius's profuseness, who pulled down Pompey's house and rebuilt it as not magnificent enough, for the Romans were much displeased with all these. But Chasar, for the prosecution of his own scheme of government, though he knew their characters and disapproved them, was forced to make use of those who would serve him. After the battles of Pharsalia, Cato and Scipio fled into Africa, and there, with the assistance of King Juba, got together a considerable force, which Chasar resolved to engage. He accordingly passed into Sicily about the winter solstice, and to remove from his officers' minds all hopes of delay there, encamped by the seashore, and as soon as ever he had a fair wind, put to sea with 3,000 foot and a few horse. When he had landed them, he went back secretly, and uttered some apprehensions for the larger part of his army, but met them upon the sea, and brought them all to the same camp. There he was informed that the enemies relied much upon an ancient oracle, that the family of Scipios should be always victorious in Africa. There was in his army a man otherwise mean and contemptible, but of the house of the Africani, and his name was Scipio Salatio. This man Chasar whether in raillery to ridicule Scipio, who commanded the enemy, or seriously to bring over the omen to his side, it were hard to say, put at the head of his troops, as if he were general, in all the frequent battles which he was compelled to fight, for he was in such want of both victualling for his men and forage for his horses. He was forced to feed the horses with seaweed, which he washed thoroughly, to take off its saltiness, and mixed with a little grass to give it a more agreeable taste. The Numidians, in great numbers and well horsed, whither he went, came up and commanded the country. Caesar's cavalry, being one day employed, diverted themselves with seeing an African, who entertained them with the dancing, and at the same time played upon the pipe to admiration. They were so taken with this that they lighted and gave their horses to some boys, when on a sudden the enemy surrounded them, killed some and pursued the rest, and fell in with them into their camp, had not Caesar himself and Asinius Pollio come to their assistance and put a stop to their flight. The war had been then at an end. In another engagement also the enemy had, again the better, when Caesar, it is said, seized a standard-bearer who was running away by the neck, and forcing him to face about, said, "Look, that is the way to the enemy." Scipio, flushed with the success at first, had a mind to come to one decisive action. He therefore left Afranius and Juba in two distinct bodies, and far distant, and marched himself towards Thapsus, where he proceeded to build a fortified camp above a lake, and serve as a center point for their operations, and also as a place of refuge. While Scipio was thus employed, Caesar, with incredible dispatch, made his way through thick woods and a country supposed to be impassable, cut off one part of the enemy, and attacked another in the front. Having routed these, he followed up his opportunity and the current of his good fortune, and on the first onset carried Afranius' camp, and ravaged that of the Numidians, Juba, their king, being glad to save himself by flight, so that in a small part of a single day he made himself master of 3 camps, and killed 50,000 of their enemy, with the loss only of 50 of his own men. This is the account some give of that fight. Others say he was not in action, but that he was taken with his usual distemper. Just as he was setting his army in order, he perceived the approaches of it, and before it had too far disordered his senses, when he was already beginning to shake under its influence, withdrew to a neighboring fort, where he reposed himself. One of the men of consular and praetorian dignity that were taken after the fight, several Caesar put to death. Others anticipated him by killing themselves. All these people killing themselves, that's not the approach here. Cato had undertaken to defend Utica, and for that reason was not in the battle. The desire which Caesar had taken him alive made him hasten thither, and upon intelligence that he had dispatched himself, he was much discomposed. For what reason is not so well agreed. He certainly said, "Cato, I must grudge your death, as you grudged me the honor of saving your life." Yet the discourse he wrote against Cato after his death is no great sign of his kindness, or that he was inclined to be reconciled to him. For how is it probable that he would have been tender of his life while he was so bitter against his memory? But from his clemency to Cicero Brutus, and many others who had fought against him, it may be divined that Caesar's book was not written so much out of animosity to Cato as in his own vindication. Cicero had written an encomium upon Cato, and called it by his name. A composition by so great a master upon so excellent a subject was sure to be in everyone's hands. This touched Caesar, who looked upon a panegyric on his enemies as no better than an invective against himself, and therefore he made in his Anticato a collection of whatever could be said to be his derogation. The two compositions, like Cato and Caesar themselves, have each of them their several admirers. Perhaps I should call my next series invectives against those who disbelieve or disobey in such and such translation, right? Well, the actual text itself, but Caesar, upon his return to Rome, did not omit to pronounce before the people a magnificent account of his victory, telling them that he had subdued a country which would supply the public every year with 200,000 Attic bushels of corn and 3,000,000 pounds weight of oil. He then led 3 triumphs for Egypt, Pontus, and Africa. The last for the victory over, not Scipio, but King Juba, as it was professed, whose little son was then carried in the triumph, the happiest captive that ever was, who of a barbarian Numidian came by this means to obtain a place among the most learned historians of Greece. After the triumphs, he distributed rewards to his soldiers and treated the people with feasting and shows. He entertained the whole people together at one feast, where 22,000 dining couches were laid out, and he made a display of gladiators and of battles by sea in honor, as he said, of his daughter Julia, though she had been long since dead. When these shows were over, an account was taken of the people who, from 320,000, were now reduced to 150,000. So great a waste had the civil war made in Rome alone, not to mention what the other parts of Italy and the provinces suffered. He was now chosen a 4th time consul, and went into Spain against Pompey's sons. They were but young, yet had gathered together a very numerous army, and showed they had courage to command it, so that Caesar was in extreme danger. The great battle was near the town of Munda, in which Caesar, seeing his men hard pressed, and making but a weak resistance, ran through the ranks among the soldiers, and crying out, asked them whether they were not ashamed to deliver him into the hands of boys. At last, with great difficulty and the best efforts he could make, he forced back the enemy, killing 30,000 of them, though the loss of 1,000 of his best men. When he came back from the fight, he told his friends that he had often fought for victory, but this was the first time he had ever fought for life. This battle was won on the feast of Bacchus, the very day in which Pompey, 4 years before, had set out for the war. Well, I personally believe that the cursed battle is the one that's, you're fighting just to conquer. You're trying to save some lives. That's a different story, right? But the younger of Pompey's sons escaped, but Decius, some days after the fight, brought the head of the elder to Caesar. This was the last war he was engaged in. The triumph which he celebrated for this victory displeased the Romans beyond anything, for he had not defeated foreign generals or barbarian kings, but had destroyed the children and family of one of the greatest men of Rome. Though unfortunate, and it did not look well to lead a procession in celebration of the calamities of his country, and to rejoice in those things for which no other apology could be made either to what they considered to be gods and goddesses or to humans, than their being absolutely necessary, besides that hitherto he had never sent letters or messengers to announce any victory over his fellow citizens, but had seemed rather to be ashamed of the action than to expect honor from it. And it's said that shame isn't a noble virtue. Because you're just feeling bad because you've failed other people's expectations. It should be your expectations. So guilt is whatever, but guilt, shame, and fear are the most basic things. Don't let people misuse you by them.